The rain fell in sheets against the tall windows of Riverside Café, each droplet catching the amber glow of Edison bulbs strung across exposed brick walls. March in Portland arrived cold and unforgiving, the kind of weather that made people huddle closer to their coffee cups and speak in hushed tones about winter refusing to release its grip. Garrett Sullivan sat in the corner booth, the same one he'd occupied on this date for 2 years running, watching his daughter Hazel trace patterns in the condensation on the glass with one small finger. She wore her purple hearing aids tonight, the ones shaped like butterflies that she'd picked out herself 6 months ago when the audiologist confirmed what Garrett had been dreading since her 4th birthday. Progressive sensorineural hearing loss, genetic origin likely inherited from Juliet's side of the family, though they'd never know for certain now. The doctor had used careful language, speaking slowly while maintaining eye contact with Hazel, as if the 6-year-old could process medical terminology about cochlear degradation and decibel thresholds. Garrett had signed the entire consultation, his hands moving through the air with a fluidity that still surprised him. Muscle memory built from 3 years of late-night YouTube tutorials and community college courses he'd squeezed between project deadlines and bedtime stories. 2 years ago today, Juliet had died in their bedroom at 4:30 in the morning, her hand going slack in his as the hospice nurse checked her pulse one final time and shook her head with professional sympathy. Stage 4. Breast cancer had taken 11 months to steal her from them. 11 months of clinical trials that failed, and radiation that burned, and chemotherapy that left her retching into a basin, while Garrett held back her hair and tried not to let Hazel see him cry. In those final weeks when Juliet could barely lift her head from the pillow, she'd made him promise to bring Hazel here every year on the anniversary to this cafe where they'd had their first date 13 years ago when Garrett was 25 and still believed architecture could change the world. Make it a celebration, not a funeral. Juliet had whispered, her voice paper thin. Show her that grief doesn't have to look like darkness. Take her somewhere beautiful and tell her stories about me. Make me immortal through memory. So Garrett had brought Hazel to Riverside Cafe on March 15th for the past 2 years, ordering the same table by the window, the same hot chocolate with extra marshmallows for his daughter, the same black coffee for himself that he'd drink while sharing stories about the woman who'd given Hazel her green eyes and stubborn chin and talent for drawing entire universes in crayon across printer paper. Tonight he'd told her about the time Juliet had gotten them kicked out of a modern art museum for arguing too loudly with a security guard about the cultural significance of a blank canvas, and Hazel had laughed with her hands covering her mouth the way Juliet used to laugh when she was being mischievous. But now Hazel had gone quiet, her attention fixed on something across the cafe. Garrett followed her gaze to a woman sitting alone at a table 15 feet away, checking her phone with the particular brand of anxiety that came from waiting too long for someone who should have already arrived. She wore a red dress that looked expensive, her dark hair pulled into a twist that exposed small hearing aids tucked behind each ear. Late 20s, Garrett guessed, with the kind of posture that suggested either dance training or years of being told to sit up straight. She kept glancing toward the entrance, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm only she could hear. Daddy Hazel signed her movements small and uncertain. That lady has hearing aids like mine. Garrett nodded, reaching across to squeeze his daughter's hand in acknowledgement. He'd learned early on not to make a spectacle of pointing out other deaf or hard-of-hearing people in public, not to treat it like spotting a rare bird, but Hazel's face had lit up with recognition that bordered on kinship. The cafe door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a man in an expensive suit who shook water from his umbrella without bothering to step onto the mat. He scanned the room with the impatient efficiency of someone checking items off a list, his gaze landing on the woman in red. She straightened immediately, a smile breaking across her face that made Garrett's chest tighten with second-hand hope. He recognized that expression had worn it himself in the early days with Juliet, when every date felt like unwrapping a gift. The man crossed to her table without returning the smile, dropping into the chair with a heavy sigh that carried even through the ambient jazz bleeding from overhead speakers. He pulled out his phone immediately, thumbs moving across the screen while the woman's smile faltered, then rebuilt itself with visible effort. Garrett looked away, focusing on his coffee. This was none of his business. Hazel had gone back to her window drawings, signing to herself in the private language she used when processing thoughts she wasn't ready to share aloud. He should pay the bill, get her home before the rain turned to sleet, tuck her into bed with the weighted blanket Juliet had ordered 3 weeks before she died because she'd read somewhere that deep pressure helped anxious children sleep. But something made him glance back at the couple's table. The woman was speaking, her hands moving in subtle gestures that suggested she was trying to keep her voice measured, and the man had finally looked up from his phone with an expression Garrett recognized from every nightmare he'd had about Hazel navigating a world that would judge her before understanding her. Disgust wrapped in a thin veneer of polite confusion, the look of someone who'd just discovered they'd been sold a product that didn't match the advertisement. "Wait," the man said, his voice carrying across the cafe with the kind of projection that suggested he didn't care who overheard. "You're deaf. Like actually deaf." The woman's hands stilled. "I have moderate to severe hearing loss. Yes, I mentioned this in my profile. I wear hearing aids, as you can see." The man leaned back in his chair, creating physical distance that felt deliberate. "You said you had hearing difficulties. I thought you meant like you needed things repeated sometimes. I didn't know you were actually handicapped." The word landed like a slap. Garrett felt his jaw clench, his hands forming fists under the table. Beside him, Hazel had stopped drawing entirely, her small body gone rigid as she tracked the conversation unfolding across the cafe. She was too young to understand all the words, but children had radar for cruelty, could sense when one person was being diminished by another. "I'm a pediatric nurse," the woman said, her voice steady despite the tremor Garrett could see in her shoulders. "I graduated from university with honors. I speak 3 languages. My hearing loss doesn't define my worth as a person. Preston." The man had a name now visible on the phone he'd carelessly placed screen up on the table, where a text from someone named Derek read, "Abort mission bro, not worth the charity case." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with an ugly screech that made several diners turn their heads. "No offense, but I have standards. This is why people should be honest in their profiles. I'm not wasting my Friday night because you couldn't be upfront about being disabled." He was gone before she could respond, shouldering past a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers, leaving only the echo of his ignorance and the soft jazz that suddenly felt too cheerful for the violence that had just occurred. The woman sat frozen, her hands still resting on the table, her face carefully blank in the way people looked when they were holding themselves together through sheer force of will. Garrett's body moved before his brain caught up, standing from the booth with enough force that his coffee cup rattled in its saucer. But Hazel was faster, slipping from her seat with the liquid grace of childhood, her small feet carrying her across the cafe before he could catch her arm and remind her about not approaching strangers. She stopped at the woman's table, her hands already moving in the formal sign language they practiced every night before bed. "That man was mean." Hazel signed, her face serious with the gravity of a 6-year-old delivering universal truth. "You're beautiful. Don't be sad." The woman's careful composure cracked, her eyes going wide with surprise. Before filling with tears, she blinked back rapidly. She looked at Hazel, then past her to Garrett, who was now standing awkwardly 3 feet away, trying to telegraph apology and solidarity in equal measure through his expression alone. "I'm so sorry," he began, his voice rough from disuse. "My daughter didn't mean to intrude. She just—" "You signed," the woman interrupted, her gaze sharp as it moved from Hazel's hands to Garrett's face, recalculating something in real time. "Both of you sign." "Hazel has progressive hearing loss," Garrett explained, dropping into the chair across from the woman without thinking about whether he'd been invited. "She was diagnosed 3 years ago when she was 3. We've been learning together." The woman studied Hazel with the kind of attention Garrett recognized from medical professionals cataloging details others might miss. "What kind of progressive loss?" "Sensorineural genetic. We're at about 60% in her left ear, 70% in her right. The audiologist thinks she'll be profoundly deaf by adolescence, maybe sooner." The words came easier now, worn smooth from repetition at specialist appointments and school IEP meetings and support group check-ins. Garrett had learned to recite his daughter's diagnosis without drowning in the weight of it, to speak about her future hearing loss the way he discussed architectural plans as facts to be navigated rather than tragedies to be mourned. "I'm Rowan," the woman said, extending her hand first to Hazel, then to Garrett. "Rowan Ashford. And that display you just witnessed was my first and last attempt at dating in 2 years, so congratulations on catching me at my absolute lowest. Garrett Sullivan. This is Hazel. And for what it's worth, that guy was an idiot. That's what my therapist keeps telling me about the idiots." Rowan's smile was real now, reaching her eyes, transforming her entire face. "Apparently they're everywhere, these idiots, and I have a gift for finding them." Hazel tugged on Garrett's sleeve. "Can I show her my drawings, Daddy?" Before he could answer, Rowan was already leaning forward, genuine interest lighting her features. "I would love to see your drawings. I bet they're amazing. They're dinosaurs mostly." Hazel signed and spoke simultaneously, a habit her speech therapist encouraged to maintain her verbal skills. "And butterflies. And sometimes dinosaurs with butterfly wings, because why should dinosaurs not get to fly? Why should they not, indeed?" Rowan agreed, her hands moving through the signs with a fluency that spoke of years of practice, not recent acquisition. Hazel, who'd been shy around strangers since Juliet died, opened up like a flower in sunlight, pulling out her sketchbook from Garrett's work bag and spreading it across the table with pride. The cafe manager appeared at their table, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes that had witnessed the entire scene. "Your meals tonight?" she said, making sure to face Rowan directly so she could read her lips if needed, "are complimentary. All 3 of you. What happened earlier was completely unacceptable, and we don't tolerate that kind of behavior in our establishment." Garrett started to protest, but the manager held up her hand. "Please, that young woman shouldn't have her evening ruined by someone's ignorance. And sir, what you did standing up for a stranger like that, we need more of that in this world." Except he hadn't stood up, Garrett thought as the manager walked away. He'd sat there frozen while his 6-year-old daughter showed more courage and compassion than he'd managed to summon. Juliet would have been on her feet before the man finished. His first cruel sentence would have eviscerated him with words sharp enough to draw blood while maintaining perfect composure. Don't fight every battle for Hazel, she'd told him near the end. But what she'd really meant was, let Hazel see you fight the battles that matter. "This one is a brachiosaurus," Hazel was explaining to Rowan, pointing to a purple creature with improbable proportions. "They're the tallest dinosaurs. Did you know they could reach up to 80 feet? That's as tall as 6 elephants standing on top of each other." "I did not know that." Rowan set her attention fully on Hazel in a way that made something tight in Garrett's chest loosen fractionally. "That's incredible. Were they carnivores or herbivores?" The conversation flowed with the easy enthusiasm of Hazel explaining her current obsession to someone who actually cared about the answers. Garrett watched Rowan track his daughter's signs, occasionally asking her to repeat something or clarify a word, treating Hazel like a person whose thoughts mattered rather than a disabled child to be humored. It was such a small thing, this genuine engagement, but Garrett had learned to recognize genuine after wading through 2 years of well-meaning people who spoke to Hazel in baby talk or addressed their questions to him instead of her. "You work with children," he said during a lull when Hazel paused to find a specific drawing. "The way you interact with Hazel, it's natural, professional." Rowan glanced up from the sketchbook. "Pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital downtown. I've been there 6 years since I finished nursing school." She hesitated, then added, "I actually think I've met Hazel before. About 2 years ago, winter admission for severe ear infection." The memory hit Garrett like physical force. January 2 years ago, when Hazel had spiked a fever of 104 and he'd driven through ice to the emergency room at 3 in the morning because her regular pediatrician's office was closed. Juliet had still been alive then, but barely too weak to come with them, and Garrett had been alone in that fluorescent-lit exam room while doctors used words like mastoiditis and possible hearing damage. "You were there," he said, the pieces clicking into place. "You drew pictures with her, kept her calm during the IV insertion." "She was scared," Rowan said simply. I showed her my hearing aids, told her we were members of the same club. She drew me a picture of a butterfly. I still have it on my refrigerator at home. Hazel looked between them, understanding dawning. You're the nice nurse, the one who taught me the sign for brave. She demonstrated her small hand moving from her chest outward in a motion Garrett recognized from their nightly practice sessions. Rowan's eyes went bright with recognition, with something deeper than professional satisfaction. You remembered, she said softly. I remember everything about that night. Hazel signed with the intensity children brought to declarations of absolute truth. Mommy was sick and couldn't come. Daddy was worried but trying not to show it. You told me brave people feel scared but do hard things anyway. Garrett's throat closed. He'd forgotten about the drawings about the nurse who'd made Hazel laugh during the worst week of their lives. The ear infection had triggered the rapid hearing decline the audiologist had explained later, though it wasn't the cause, just the catalyst for something already written into Hazel's genetic code. That night in the emergency room had been the beginning of accepting what was coming, what they couldn't stop, no matter how many specialists they consulted or alternative treatments they tried. Juliet had made him promise not to rage against it, not to waste energy fighting biology. Adapt, she'd said, her hand trembling as she signed the word. Show Hazel how to adapt with grace instead of bitterness. Make her deafness something she owns, not something that owns her. I should let you two get back to your evening, Rowan said, starting to gather her purse. I didn't mean to crash your dinner. You're not crashing, Hazel signed emphatically. Daddy and I come here every year on the day Mommy went to heaven. We tell stories about her and eat good food and remember happy things. Right, Daddy? Right, sweetheart? Garrett managed, though his voice came out strangled. Rowan's expression softened with understanding that held no pity, only recognition of a grief she couldn't fully know but wouldn't minimize. I'm so sorry for your loss. The words people always said, the ones Garrett had heard hundreds of times in 2 years, but coming from Rowan they felt less like obligatory condolence and more like genuine acknowledgement. She didn't ask how Juliet died or offer platitudes about time healing wounds or tell him that Hazel was lucky to have such a devoted father. She just sat there present with their pain without trying to fix it. Can Rowan stay for dinner? Hazel asked, turning to Garrett with pleading eyes. Please. She likes dinosaurs and she knows sign language and her date was mean, so she's sad and we have extra food because the nice lady said it's free. Garrett looked at Rowan, trying to communicate a dozen things at once through eye contact alone. That he wasn't hitting on her, wasn't trying to take advantage of her vulnerability, wasn't looking for anything except maybe proving to his daughter that kindness existed outside their immediate family. That he'd understand completely if she wanted to leave, wanted to process the ugliness of the evening alone, wanted nothing to do with a widower and his disabled daughter and their complicated grief. But Rowan was already smiling, settling back into her chair with visible relief. I would love to stay for dinner. Thank you for the invitation, Hazel. And Garrett, she added, meeting his eyes with directness that felt like a challenge and a gift. I'm glad your daughter has better manners than you. She asked first. The tension broke, replaced by something lighter that felt dangerous in its ease. They ordered food, the manager recommending the cafe's signature pasta dish that Rowan accepted with thanks, while Hazel requested her usual chicken fingers, and Garrett stuck with the same burger he'd eaten on every anniversary visit. The conversation flowed with surprising natural rhythm, Hazel dominating the discussion with enthusiastic explanations of her current interests, while Rowan asked follow-up questions that demonstrated actual engagement. Garrett found himself relaxing incrementally, the knot of anxiety that lived permanently between his shoulder blades loosening as he watched his daughter interact with someone new without the usual wariness she'd developed since Juliet's death. Hazel had become clingy in the aftermath, suspicious of change, resistant to new people entering their carefully constructed bubble of two. Her therapist called it a normal response to loss, especially for a child already navigating the profound change of progressive hearing loss. But with Rowan, Hazel seemed to recognize something familiar, a kindred spirit navigating the same world of sound and silence. She showed Rowan how her hearing aids worked, demonstrating the different settings for different environments, explaining that sometimes when things got too loud, she could turn them down and make the noise go away like magic. Rowan shared her own tricks, the way she'd learned to read lips so well that most people didn't realize she was deaf until they tried to talk to her from behind the strategic seating arrangements she'd mastered for restaurants and meetings. "Do people treat you differently?" Hazel asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood when they find out you can't hear good. Rowan considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, yes. Some people talk louder as if volume is the problem. Some people avoid looking at me when they speak, which makes it harder to read their lips. And some people, like that man who left earlier, decide I'm not worth their time because they can't see past the hearing aids." "But you're a nurse," Hazel said, confusion evident in her signing. "You help sick kids feel better. That's important." "It is important," Rowan agreed. "But not everyone values the same things. Some people only see what's different, not what's valuable." Garrett watched his daughter process this information, her face serious with concentration. "That's dumb," she signed finally. "It is dumb," Rowan confirmed, and they grinned at each other with the solidarity of shared understanding. The food arrived, interrupting the moment. They ate with comfortable quiet, punctuated by Hazel's observations about the rain patterns on the window and Rowan's stories about particularly memorable young patients. Garrett contributed less content to observe the way Rowan adapted her communication style seamlessly for Hazel, speaking and signing simultaneously, maintaining eye contact, asking for clarification when she missed something rather than pretending to understand. He tried not to think about how long it had been since he'd had an adult conversation that didn't revolve around construction permits or Hazel's education plan. Tried not to notice how Rowan's laugh sounded like wind chimes, or how her hands moved through sign language with the grace of someone speaking their native tongue. Tried not to feel the weight of Juliet's absence pressing against his chest like a physical thing. 2 years wasn't very long, his grief counselor had said during their last session 4 months ago. Give yourself permission to still be healing. You don't have to be ready for anything you're not ready for. But sitting across from Rowan, watching her show Hazel how to sign complicated medical terms by breaking them into smaller components, Garrett felt something shift inside him that felt suspiciously like hope. Not romantic hope necessarily, though. He'd be lying if he said he hadn't noticed Rowan was beautiful, but something broader and more terrifying. The hope that maybe their world of two could expand without collapsing. That letting someone new in wouldn't mean pushing Juliet out. That Hazel could have other adults in her life who saw her fully, not as the deaf kid or the motherless child or the project to be fixed, but as herself, complex and brilliant and worthy of genuine engagement. "Why are you doing this?" Garrett asked when Hazel excused herself to use the bathroom. Her empty plate pushed aside, her energy still running high despite the late hour. "Staying here with us? You could have left after Hazel approached you. You didn't owe us anything." Rowan finished her last bite of pasta before answering. "When I was first diagnosed with hearing loss 9 years ago, right after the accident that caused it, I was angry. Furious at the drunk driver who'd hit my car, at the doctors who couldn't fix the damage, at myself for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I isolated, pushed away my friends and family, convinced myself I was damaged goods nobody would want around." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "A woman I'd never met before found me crying in a grocery store parking lot 6 months after the accident. I'd just had someone yell at me for not responding when they called my name from behind, and I was having a complete breakdown in my car. This stranger knocked on my window, waited for me to lower it, and said, 'I don't know what happened, but I know that look. Whatever you're feeling right now, it won't always feel this heavy.'" Did it help? Garrett asked, though he already knew the answer. "It saved my life," Rowan said simply. Not because her words were particularly profound, but because she stopped, because she saw me in my worst moment and didn't look away. So when I saw Hazel coming toward me tonight with those big eyes and that determined little face, I thought, here's my chance to be that person for someone else. "She's not you," Garrett said, the words coming out sharper than intended. "Hazel's situation is different. She's 6 years old. She's losing her hearing progressively. She lost her mother to cancer. She doesn't need someone's pity project." Rowan's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, became more solid. "You're right. She's not me." But you know what I saw when she came over? I saw a brave kid who recognized someone in pain and decided to do something about it. I saw someone who already understands that being different isn't being broken. And I saw a father who's terrified of letting anyone new into their world because the last person they let in died and left a hole that feels impossible to fill. The accuracy of it knocked the air from Garrett's lungs. He wanted to argue, to tell Rowan she had no idea what she was talking about, that she was making assumptions based on 10 minutes of observation. But they'd been sitting here for over an hour now, and in that time he'd felt more seen, more understood than in 2 years of well-meaning casseroles and awkward condolence calls from people who'd known Juliet in life but couldn't comprehend the magnitude of her absence. "I'm not good at this," he admitted finally. "The letting people in part. Juliet was the social one. She made friends everywhere we went, collected people like some people collect stamps. After she died, most of them disappeared. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to say or how to help, and grief makes people uncomfortable." "It does," Rowan agreed. "It's messy and unpredictable, and it makes people face their own mortality. Much easier to send a card and move on." Hazel bounded back to the table, her hands already moving in excited signs. "There's a piano in the back room. Can I go look at it?" "Please." Garrett checked with the manager, who nodded permission, and Hazel skipped off toward the small performance space the cafe used for open mic nights. Through the archway they could see her examining the upright piano with reverent curiosity, her fingers hovering over the keys without actually pressing them. "She's wonderful," Rowan said, watching Hazel with an expression Garrett couldn't quite parse. "You're doing an incredible job with her. Most days I feel like I'm failing." Garrett admitted the exhaustion he usually kept locked away seeping into his voice. "I'm learning sign language, but not fast enough. I'm researching cochlear implants, but can't decide if they're right for her. I'm trying to find the balance between protecting her and letting her be independent, and I'm terrified I'm getting it wrong. Juliet would know what to do. Juliet always knew." "Juliet isn't here," Rowan said, not unkindly. "You are. And from where I'm sitting, you're doing exactly what Hazel needs. You're showing up, you're learning, you're letting her see that adaptation is possible, that her deafness is just one part of who she is, not the whole story." "How do you know that's what I'm doing?" Garrett asked. "You met us an hour ago." "Because I watch how she signs, how comfortable she is in her body, how she approaches strangers without shame about her hearing aids. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because someone taught her she's worth approaching the world with confidence." Garrett felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening. He wanted to tell Rowan about the nights he stayed up until 3 in the morning, watching YouTube tutorials on advanced sign language grammar, about the financial stress of specialist appointments and hearing aid upgrades and speech therapy sessions, about the loneliness of parenting alone, of making every decision without a partner to share the weight, about the guilt that came with feeling attracted to someone who wasn't Juliet, even in the most abstract sense. But Hazel was coming back now, her face lit with excitement. "The piano is out of tune," she signed, "but it still sounds pretty. Can we get a piano?" "Daddy will see." Sweetheart, Garrett signed back the universal parent response that meant probably not. "But I don't want to say no right now." "It's getting late," Rowan said, checking her phone. "I should let you two get home. Thank you for letting me crash your anniversary dinner." It turned a pretty terrible evening into something actually meaningful. "Will you come to our house for pancakes on Saturday?" Hazel asked before Garrett could formulate a more adult goodbye. "Daddy makes terrible pancakes, but we have good syrup." "Please." Rowan looked at Garrett, a question in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. Was she asking permission? Offering him an out? Checking if this was something he actually wanted, or just his daughter's impulsive invitation? Hazel Garrett started trying to find words that wouldn't disappoint his daughter, while also not pressuring Rowan into something she might not want. 9 o'clock, Rowan interrupted her decision, apparently made. "I'll bring fruit salad. And Hazel, for the record, I bet your dad's pancakes are better than mine. I once set scrambled eggs on fire." "How is that even possible?" Garrett asked despite himself. "I have no idea," Rowan admitted. "But it happened. There was smoke and everything." Hazel dissolved into giggles, the sound carrying across the cafe in a way that made other diners smile. Garrett pulled out his phone and they exchanged numbers with the practical efficiency of parents arranging a playdate, though this felt like something more precarious, more loaded with possibility and danger. They walked out together into the rain that had softened to a drizzle, standing under the cafe's awning, while Garrett tried to remember where he'd parked. Rowan's car was closer, a silver sedan with a parking permit for the hospital visible on the dashboard. "Thank you," she said to Garrett, her voice quiet enough that Hazel, who'd run ahead to splash in a puddle, wouldn't hear. "For not letting your daughter see you feel sorry for me. For treating tonight like it was normal, two people having dinner instead of a charity case and her rescuers." "We weren't rescuing you," Garrett said, the words coming out more intense than he'd intended. "You didn't need rescuing. That guy was an idiot who couldn't see what was right in front of him." Rowan studied his face for a long moment, and Garrett felt himself being catalogued, assessed, understood in ways that felt invasive and necessary in equal measure. "Most people can't," she said finally, "see what's right in front of them. They see the hearing aids and their brains fill in a whole story about limitation and burden and everything I supposedly can't do. They don't see the person." "I see you," Garrett said, then immediately felt like an idiot for saying something so heavy, so loaded with implication. "I mean, Hazel sees you. We both see." "I know what you meant," Rowan interrupted gently. "And for what it's worth, I see you too. A dad trying to be everything for his daughter. A man still in love with his late wife. Someone terrified of moving forward but doing it anyway because standing still isn't an option when you have a 6-year-old who needs you." The accuracy of her observation should have felt like violation, but instead it landed like relief. Someone understood without him having to explain, without him having to perform competence or hide his exhaustion or pretend he had everything figured out. Saturday, he confirmed because he didn't know what else to say. Saturday. Rowan agreed, and then she was walking to her car, and Garrett was collecting Hazel from her puddle exploration, and they were driving home through rain that turned to mist. "Did you have fun tonight?" Daddy, Hazel signed from the back seat when they stopped at a red light. "I did, sweetheart." "Did you?" Hazel nodded emphatically. "Rowan is nice. She didn't treat me like a baby. She talked to me like I'm a real person." "You are a real person." Garrett signed back something tight wrapping around his heart. "I know, but lots of grown-ups forget. They talk to you instead of me when I ask questions, or they use baby words, or they pat my head like I'm a puppy." The light turned green. Garrett navigated the familiar streets toward their house in the suburbs, a 3-bedroom craftsman he and Juliet had bought when Hazel was 2, back when they thought they'd fill the extra rooms with more children, back when cancer was something that happened to other families. Now those empty rooms served as his home office and a guest room that never had guests. "Can I tell you something?" Daddy, Hazel signed when they pulled into the driveway. "Anything, always. I don't think Mommy would be mad if you made a new friend. I think she'd be happy you smiled tonight. You don't smile very much anymore." The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were observant, perceptive in the way children could be when adults forgot they were watching. Garrett had tried so hard to shield Hazel from his grief, to save his crying for late nights when she was asleep, to maintain cheerful competence during waking hours. But children weren't fooled by performance. They sensed what lived underneath. "I smiled because of you," he signed, deflecting, "because I got to spend the evening with my favorite person." And Rowan, Hazel added stubbornly, "You smiled because Rowan was funny and nice and she liked my dinosaur drawings." Garrett couldn't argue with that. He helped Hazel out of the car, through the front door, through the bedtime routine of teeth brushing and pajamas and the weighted blanket Juliet had ordered. He read 3 chapters of the current Magic Tree House book they were working through, signing the whole time, because Hazel had started asking him to, even though her hearing aids were still functional enough for her to follow the words. When she was finally settled, her nightlight casting purple stars across the ceiling, she signed one more time. "Daddy, I really like Rowan. I hope she comes on Saturday." "Me too, sweetheart. Now sleep." But after he'd closed her door and returned to the living room, Garrett found himself standing in front of the mantel where Juliet's urn sat next to their wedding photo and a candle that had burned down to almost nothing over 2 years of nightly lighting. He'd started the tradition the week after she died, lighting it every evening and letting it burn until he went to bed, a small ritual of remembrance that had become as automatic as breathing. Tonight he stood there longer than usual, studying Juliet's face in the photograph. She'd been 32 when it was taken, 5 years younger than Garrett was, now healthy and whole, and laughing at something the photographer had said. Looking at her still hurt, but it was a different hurt than those first months, when even glancing at her photo felt like swallowing glass. "I met someone," he said aloud, to the empty room, to the photograph, to the ghost of his wife, that he sometimes felt watching from the corners of their house. Not like that, not romantically, just someone who understood about Hazel. Someone who made me remember what it feels like to talk to another adult about something other than medical appointments and school forms. Someone who made Hazel laugh. He waited, half expecting some sign that Juliet was listening, that she approved or disapproved or had any opinion at all. But there was only silence, the kind that used to terrify him when he first became a widower, the absence of her breathing beside him in bed, her humming in the kitchen, her voice calling goodnight to Hazel from the hallway. He'd adapted to silence, now had learned to fill it with other sounds, other routines. But sometimes, like tonight, it still pressed against him with physical weight. The video he remembered suddenly, the one Juliet had recorded near the end when she could barely sit up but had insisted on leaving final messages for both him and Hazel. He'd watched his dozens of times in the first 6 months, then put it away because hearing her voice had become more painful than comforting. But tonight he wanted to hear her, needed her guidance, even though he knew she couldn't actually provide it. He found his laptop, opened the protected folder, clicked on the file labeled, "For Garrett, when you're ready." Juliet appeared on screen, skeletal from chemo, her voice paper-thin, but her eyes still bright with the determination that had characterized everything she did. "If you're watching this, I'm gone," she began, the bluntness so characteristic of who she'd been. "And you're probably beating yourself up for something because that's what you do. So let me say this clearly. Stop it. You were the best husband I could have asked for. You held my hand through everything. You never made me feel like my cancer was a burden. You showed Hazel how to love someone even when they're falling apart. That matters more than you know." She paused, gathering strength. "I need you to promise me something, and I know you're going to resist, but I'm going to be dead, so you have to listen. Promise me you won't let fear make you small. Hazel is going to lose her hearing, and that's going to be scary, but I've seen you learn sign language. I've watched you research and adapt and refuse to treat her deafness like a tragedy. Keep doing that. Show her that different doesn't mean broken." Another pause, longer this time. "And Garrett, here's the hard part. Don't let fear stop you from living, from finding joy again, from meeting people who might become important to you. I'm not giving you permission to move on because you don't need my permission. You're a living person with years ahead of you, and I refuse to be the ghost that haunts you into loneliness." Garrett felt tears tracking down his face, the same ones that came every time he watched this video. Juliet had known him so completely, had understood that his grief would turn inward, become a prison he'd build around himself in the name of loyalty. "When you meet someone new," Juliet continued, "and you will meet someone, don't compare them to me. Don't let guilt make you believe that loving anyone else means you loved me less. The heart doesn't work like that. It expands. It makes room. Show Hazel what that looks like, that love doesn't have to be scarce or afraid." She leaned closer to the camera, and Garrett could see the effort it cost her. "Don't let fear make you small," she repeated. "Be brave enough to be happy. That's what I want for you. That's what I need you to promise me." The video ended. Garrett sat in the dark living room, Juliet's words echoing in his head alongside Rowan's observation from earlier. A man still in love with his late wife. Someone terrified of moving forward but doing it anyway because standing still isn't an option. He wasn't ready for anything resembling romance, might never be ready. But Hazel had made a friend tonight, someone who understood her world in ways Garrett was still learning. And maybe he'd made the beginning of something too, not a replacement for what he'd lost, but an expansion of what remained. A widening of their circle of two to include someone who saw them clearly without pity or discomfort. Saturday, he thought, pancakes and fruit salad and conversation with someone who treated Hazel like a whole person instead of a diagnosis. It wasn't moving on exactly, but it was moving, which was more than he'd managed in 2 years. He closed the laptop, extinguished Juliet's candle, and went to bed in the house that still felt too big in sheets that still smelled faintly of her lavender lotion, though he'd washed them 100 times. Sleep came eventually, and with it, dreams of Riverside Cafe and rain on windows, and Hazel laughing with her hands in the air, signing stories to someone who understood every word. Saturday arrived with weak sunlight filtering through Portland's perpetual cloud cover, the kind of morning that promised rain by afternoon, but allowed for a few hours of pretending spring might actually come. Garrett stood in his kitchen at 8:15, staring at the mixing bowl like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't articulated yet. Pancake batter shouldn't require this much deliberation, but he'd already restarted twice, convinced the consistency was wrong, that the blueberries were distributed unevenly, that Juliet would have known instinctively what he was getting wrong. "Daddy, you're thinking too loud," Hazel signed from her perch at the breakfast bar. She'd been awake since 6, had changed outfits 3 times, and was currently wearing her purple dress with the dinosaur print and her butterfly hearing aids polished to gleaming. Her hair, which Garrett had attempted to braid following a YouTube tutorial, looked lopsided, but she'd refused to let him fix it. "I'm not thinking loud, I'm thinking at a normal volume. Your face gets all scrunchy when you're worried. Like this." Hazel demonstrated, wrinkling her forehead in exaggerated concern, and despite his anxiety, Garrett felt himself smile. The doorbell rang at precisely 9 o'clock. Hazel launched herself from the bar stool with enough force to make Garrett wince, already running toward the front door before he could remind her about checking through the peephole first. He followed, dish towel still in hand, arriving just as Hazel flung the door open to reveal Rowan standing on the porch with a covered bowl and an expression that managed to project both confidence and uncertainty. She'd dressed casually in jeans and a green sweater that made her eyes look almost hazel in the morning light. No makeup that Garrett could detect, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of the formal twist from their first meeting. She looked younger like this, more approachable, though he noticed the way her hands gripped the bowl suggested she was as nervous as he felt. "I brought fruit salad," she announced, holding up the bowl like evidence. "Strawberries, grapes, melon, and blueberries. I hope nobody's allergic." Hazel grabbed her hand without hesitation, pulling her into the house. "Come see my room, I have new drawings to show you." "Maybe let Rowan put the fruit salad in the kitchen first," Garrett suggested, but Rowan was already being dragged down the hallway, laughing at Hazel's enthusiasm. He took the bowl to the refrigerator, using the moment alone to steady himself. This was just breakfast. Just a meal with someone Hazel liked, someone who understood their situation without needing extensive explanation. Nothing complicated, nothing that required emotional excavation or examination of what he was feeling, or why having Rowan in his house made the space feel simultaneously more full and more exposed. The kitchen still looked like Juliet's domain, despite 2 years of Garrett living here alone. Her recipe box sat on the counter, her handwriting on the magnetic grocery list pad, her collection of vintage mixing bowls that she'd insisted made baking taste better. He'd changed nothing after she died, couldn't bring himself to erase the physical evidence of her presence, and now he wondered what Rowan saw when she looked around. A shrine, a man unable to move forward, a house stuck in amber. "This is Juliet," Hazel was saying from the hallway, and Garrett returned to find his daughter showing Rowan the collection of framed photographs arranged along the wall leading to the bedrooms. Wedding photos, vacation shots, candid moments from before. Cancer had turned their lives into a series of hospital waiting rooms and treatment schedules. "She's beautiful," Rowan signed, studying a picture of Juliet holding newborn Hazel in the hospital, her expression radiant with exhausted joy. "You have her smile. Everyone says I look like Daddy." Hazel signed back. "But I got Mommy's smile and her hands. See, long fingers good for piano." She demonstrated, splaying her fingers wide, and Rowan nodded seriously as if evaluating an important claim. "You're right. Pianist hands. Have you started lessons?" "Not yet. Daddy says we need to wait until my hearing stabilizes, but I don't think it's going to stabilize. I think it's just going to keep getting worse until I can't hear anything." The matter-of-fact delivery of this observation hit Garrett in the chest. They'd discussed the progression in age-appropriate terms, had prepared Hazel for the likelihood of profound deafness. but hearing her state it so plainly stripped away the protective layers he'd built around the reality. "Then you'll learn piano through vibration and visual cues," Rowan signed without missing a beat. "Deaf musicians exist. Deaf dancers exist. Deaf everything exists. Your ears don't determine what you're capable of learning." Hazel absorbed this with visible relief, her shoulders relaxing fractionally. "You really believe that I know that? I work with kids every day who've been told they can't do things because of disabilities. And you know what the ones who succeed have in common? Adults who refuse to let them believe in can't." Garrett felt something shift in his chest, gratitude mixed with inadequacy. He'd tried to communicate this message to Hazel, had researched and advocated and insisted to teachers and therapists that his daughter's potential wasn't limited by her hearing loss. But hearing it from Rowan, someone who'd navigated the same challenges and emerged successful on the other side, carried different weight. "Pancakes are probably burning," he signed, though he'd turned off the stove before answering the door. They ate at the kitchen table, Hazel monopolizing conversation with detailed explanations of her school's upcoming spring concert and the drama surrounding who got to be narrator for the class play. Rowan listened with genuine attention, asking clarifying questions, laughing at Hazel's impressions of her teacher's frustrated attempts to teach the class about inside voices. The pancakes weren't terrible, though they weren't particularly good either. Rowan's fruit salad saved the meal fresh and bright against Garrett's heavy carbohydrates. They fell into easy rhythm, Hazel chattering while Garrett and Rowan exchanged glances that felt conspiratorial, united in their amusement at the 6-year-old's worldview. After breakfast, Hazel insisted on showing Rowan her room, which meant 40 minutes of detailed tour through every drawing, every stuffed animal, every book with extensive backstory about how she'd acquired it. Garrett cleaned the kitchen, listening to the murmur of voices and occasional laughter from down the hall, trying not to examine too closely why having someone else's presence in the house felt both foreign and necessary. He was loading the dishwasher when Rowan appeared in the doorway alone. "Hazel's organizing her rock collection by color," she signed. "She told me to tell you she needs at least 30 minutes of focused work time." That sounds like something her teacher says. Word for word, apparently. Rowan leaned against the door frame, watching him rinse plates with more attention than the task required. "Your daughter is remarkable. You know that, right? Most days I'm just trying to keep her alive and reasonably happy. You're doing more than that. She's confident, articulate, emotionally intelligent beyond her years. That doesn't happen by accident." Garrett set down the plate he'd been holding. "I spend most of my time terrified I'm screwing everything up, that I'm too protective or not protective enough, that I'm letting my grief damage her, that she'll remember these years as the time her dad was too broken to be fully present." The honesty surprised him even as he signed it. He didn't talk like this with anyone, hadn't even managed this level of vulnerability with his grief counselor before he'd stopped going 4 months ago. Rowan moved into the kitchen properly, pulling out one of the bar stools and settling onto it with deliberate casualness. "Can I tell you what I see when I watch you with Hazel? I'm not sure I want to know. I see a father who learned an entire language so his daughter wouldn't feel alone, who brings her to a café every year to celebrate her mother's life instead of mourning her death, who freezes when strangers are cruel because he's trying to respect her autonomy to fight her own battles, who makes mediocre pancakes because he's trying, and that's what matters." "They're not mediocre," Garrett protested weakly. "They're aggressively average." Rowan's laugh felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "The point is, you're not broken. You're grieving, which is different. And Hazel sees the difference too. She knows you're sad sometimes, but she also knows you show up for her every single day. That's not damage, that's devotion." Garrett wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the absolution she was offering. But guilt had lived in his chest for so long it had become structural load-bearing. If he removed it, what would hold him upright? "How did you do it?" he asked. "After your accident, when you lost your hearing, how did you get from angry and isolated to where you are now?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the granite countertop. "Therapy eventually. A support group I hated going to but kept attending anyway. Time, though, I know that's a useless answer when you're in the middle of it. And honestly, Spite, fury at everyone who'd written me off or pitied me or suggested I'd never have a normal life. I became a pediatric nurse partially to help kids and partially to prove I could do something people said would be too difficult for someone deaf. Spite as motivation. I liked that. It got me through nursing school. Then I met kids like Hazel and realized I wanted to do more than just prove people wrong. I wanted to show them what possible looked like. She hesitated, then added, I still have bad days. Days when I'm exhausted from reading lips and navigating a world designed for hearing people. Days when I want to scream at the universe for the drunk driver who hit me and destroyed my life plans. Acceptance isn't linear. What were your life plans? Before the accident. Concert pianist. Rowan's smile turned rueful. I was at Juilliard full scholarship, convinced I was going to play Carnegie Hall by 25. The accident happened during spring break my sophomore year. Traumatic brain injury damaged auditory nerves. Everything changed overnight. Garrett absorbed this information, recalibrating his understanding of the woman sitting across from him. I'm sorry, don't be. I grieved that version of myself for years, and sometimes I still do. But I also know I'm doing work that matters now. Those kids I see in the hospital, the ones scared about their diagnoses or their treatments or their differences, I can reach them in ways hearing nurses can't. Not better, just different. My loss gave me access to understanding their fear. Does it feel like a fair trade? Losing your dream for finding a different purpose, Rowan considered the question with visible honesty. Some days, yes. Some days, absolutely not. Some days I hear music, which I can still do through my hearing aids when I crank them up, and I mourn everything I'll never play again. But then I think about the girl last week who came in terrified about getting her first hearing aids, and I showed her mine, and her whole face changed. That version of me, the concert pianist, couldn't have done that. So maybe fair is the wrong question. Maybe it just is. The dishwasher was full. Garrett started it, the mechanical hum filling the silence that had settled between them. Through the wall they could hear Hazel singing to herself, the pitch uncertain, but the enthusiasm clear. I keep waiting to stop missing Juliet, Garrett admitted. Everyone says it gets easier, that time heals all those platitudes people offer at funerals, but it's been 2 years, and some days the missing is just as sharp as the day she died. How do you know when you're ready to stop being defined by loss? You don't stop being defined by it. You just add other definitions. Rowan's hands moved slowly, deliberately. You're not just Hazel's father or Juliet's widower. You're an architect, a man who makes terrible pancakes, someone who learns languages for the people he loves. The loss is part of your story, but it's not the whole story. Before Garrett could respond, Hazel appeared in the doorway. I finished organizing. Want to see... They spent the next hour in Hazel's room examining rocks arranged in careful gradients from white to black with every shade between. Rowan asked questions about where each stone had been found, what made certain ones special, whether Hazel had names for her favorites. The attention clearly delighted his daughter, who expanded under Rowan's interest like a flower following sun. Around noon, Hazel started showing signs of fatigue, her signing becoming less precise, her enthusiasm waning. Garrett recognized the pattern, knew she'd need quiet time soon to recharge from the social energy she'd been expending all morning. I should probably go. Rowan signed, reading the room with practiced ease. Let you guys have your afternoon. Can you come back next week? Hazel asked, exhaustion making her blunt. I like when you're here, if your dad says it's okay. They both looked at Garrett, and he felt the weight of decision pressing against him. This was the moment where he could retreat, could thank Rowan for coming, and let it remain a one-time occurrence, could protect himself and Hazel from the vulnerability of letting someone new become important. Or he could choose to expand their circle to risk the possibility of loss again, because the alternative was isolation. Next Saturday he signed before he could overthink it. Same time. I'll work on my pancake technique. Rowan's smile reached her eyes, genuine pleasure that she didn't try to hide. I'll bring something more substantial than fruit salad. Maybe muffins. I'm told I make acceptable muffins. Better than acceptable? Hazel corrected with 6-year-old certainty. You probably make amazing muffins. At the door, Rowan paused, her hand on the knob. Thank you for this, for letting me be part of your Saturday morning. It means more than you probably realize. Thank you for coming, Garrett replied, then added, for seeing Hazel the way you do. As a whole person, not a diagnosis. For seeing you both that way. Rowan's gaze held his for a moment longer than necessary, and Garrett felt something pass between them. Recognition, or understanding, or possibility he wasn't ready to name. After she left, Hazel climbed onto the couch and promptly fell asleep, her small body curled against the cushions in the boneless way of exhausted children. Garrett covered her with a blanket, then stood watching her breathe this tiny human who'd inherited Juliet's smile and her own particular brand of determination. His phone buzzed with a text message. Rowan. Thank Hazel again for me, and thank you for taking a chance on inviting a stranger into your home. I know that wasn't easy. Garrett stared at the message fingers hovering over the keyboard. The easy response would be something casual, breezy, maintaining emotional distance. Instead, he typed, "It was easier than I expected. You're good for her, for both of us." He deleted it immediately, tried again. "Thank you for being patient with her, and with me." Also deleted. Finally, he settled on, "Same time next week, looking forward to it." Rowan's response came quickly, "Me too." The following Saturday established a pattern. Rowan arrived at 9 with homemade blueberry muffins that were indeed better than acceptable. Hazel dragged her through the house to see new drawings, new rocks, new library books about subjects ranging from volcanoes to veterinary medicine. They ate together, conversation flowing with increasing ease, and Garrett found himself looking forward to Saturday mornings with an anticipation that felt both welcome and terrifying. By the 4th week, he stopped measuring ingredients quite so carefully, stopped worrying about whether his house measured up to some undefined standard. Rowan had seen him at his most uncertain, had witnessed his mediocre cooking and lopsided furniture arrangement and the shrine-like quality of Juliet's preserved spaces, and she kept coming back. The 5th Saturday in May brought unseasonable warmth. Portland's version of spring finally arriving with conviction. Hazel suggested they eat on the back deck, and Garrett agreed, despite his awareness that the outdoor furniture was weathered from 2 years of neglect. He'd meant to stain it last summer, had added it to a mental list of projects that remained perpetually unstarted. "This is perfect," Rowan signed as they settled at the patio table surrounded by overgrown garden beds that Juliet had planted and Garrett had failed to maintain. The wild roses had taken over, climbing the fence in thorny abundance, and forget-me-nots carpeted the spaces between flagstones. "It's a mess," Garrett corrected. "Juliet was the gardener. I just mow the lawn occasionally and hope the neighbors don't complain. I like it wild." Rowan's gaze moved across the garden with appreciation. Too much control is exhausting. Sometimes things should just grow the way they want to grow. Hazel disappeared into the yard after breakfast, digging in a corner where she'd designated her fossil excavation site, despite Garrett's explanations that Portland wasn't known for fossil deposits. They watched her work with focused intensity, her small hands moving earth with plastic tools from a long-abandoned sandbox. "How's the support group?" Rowan asked. "Hazel mentioned you run meetings for families dealing with hearing loss," Garrett corrected. "Past tense. It fell apart about 3 months ago. People stopped coming and I didn't have the energy to rebuild it." "What happened?" He'd known the question would come. Eventually had tried to prepare an answer that didn't expose too much of his failure. "Burnout, mostly. I started the group right after Hazel's diagnosis when I was desperate for community and resources. We met monthly, shared experiences, supported each other. But then Juliet got sick and I had to step back. By the time she died and I tried to restart things, everyone had moved on or found other resources. Or maybe they needed you to be stable and you weren't," Rowan suggested gently. "That's not failure. That's being human during impossible circumstances." I let them down. There was one family in particular, parents with twins who'd both been diagnosed deaf. They were terrified, overwhelmed, and I promised I'd be there to help them navigate everything. But I couldn't because I was barely navigating my own life. Last I heard, they'd moved to Seattle to be closer to better services. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to restart it?" The group. "I don't know if I have the capacity," Running a support group requires showing up consistently, being emotionally available, having answers. I'm not sure I have. What if you didn't have to do it alone? The suggestion hung in the air between them. Garrett studied Rowan's expression, trying to determine if this was genuine offer or polite hypothetical. You'd want to be involved. I work with these families all the time at the hospital, but I can't give them the kind of ongoing support a group provides. If we co-facilitated split the responsibilities, it might be sustainable. She paused, then added, but only if you actually want to. Don't rebuild something out of guilt. I want Hazel to grow up with community. Other kids like her other families who understand. I want her to see that her deafness is just one part of a larger identity, not an isolating factor. Then let's do it. Rowan's decisiveness cut through his hesitation. We'll start small, reach out to families at Children's Hospital, set up a trial meeting and see who shows up. Just like that? Just like that? Life's too short to waste time on maybe and what if. Either we do it or we don't. Garrett felt himself smile despite the anxiety churning in his gut. Okay, yes, let's do it. They spent the next hour planning, Rowan pulling up contacts on her phone while Garrett sketched out possible meeting formats on a notepad. Hazel joined them eventually, dirt-streaked and triumphant, with a rock she'd convinced herself was a fossilized dinosaur bone. She climbed into Rowan's lap without asking permission, a casual intimacy that made Garrett's breath catch. When had this happened? When had his daughter decided Rowan was safe enough to curl against, important enough to share her discoveries with? When had their Saturday morning routine become essential rather than experimental? I should tell you something, Rowan said when Hazel had gone back to her excavation site. About why I was on that dating app, why I was at the cafe that night. You don't owe me your story, I know, but I want you to understand. She took a breath. I spent 8 years after my accident convinced I was unlovable because of my deafness. I dated occasionally, always waiting for the moment when the person would realize I was too much work, too complicated. And they always did eventually. Some lasted months, some barely made it past a few dates, but the pattern was consistent. So I stopped trying for a while, focused on my career, convinced myself I was fine alone. You weren't fine alone, Garrett guessed. Nobody is, not really. We're not built for isolation. So I tried again, created the dating profile, was completely honest about my hearing loss because I was tired of the surprise factor. And still, I got Preston, who saw the words hearing impaired and filled in his own story about what that meant without bothering to know me as a person. I'm sorry that happened to you. Don't be. Because it led me here to this deck, watching your daughter dig for imaginary fossils, planning a support group with someone who actually understands. Rowan's hands stilled her expression, serious. I need you to know I'm not doing this because I'm lonely, or because I see you and Hazel as a project to fix. I'm doing this because I like being here, because Hazel is extraordinary, and you're doing everything right even though you think you're failing. Because for the first time in years, Saturday mornings feel like something to look forward to instead of just another day to get through. The honesty of it stripped away Garrett's usual defenses, left him exposed to the realization that he felt the same way. That he'd started planning his weeks around Saturday at 9 o'clock. That he'd catch himself thinking about things Rowan would find funny or interesting and storing them up to share. That Hazel had started asking every morning if it was Saturday yet, counting down days with visible impatience. I like having you here too, he admitted, more than I probably should this early in whatever this is. Whatever this is, Rowan repeated, testing the phrase. What do you think this is? Garrett didn't have an answer. Friendship seemed inadequate, but relationship felt presumptuous. They hadn't defined anything, hadn't discussed expectations or boundaries or what they meant to each other beyond the practical arrangement of Saturday breakfasts and support group planning. Before he could formulate a response, his phone rang. The screen showed Warren Caldwell, Juliet's father, calling from Charleston. Garrett's stomach dropped. Warren never called unless something was wrong or he wanted to discuss Hazel's welfare, with the implication that Garrett might not be handling it properly. I need to take this, he signed to Rowan. Juliet's father. He walked into the house, sliding the glass door shut behind him. Warren Garrett. The voice on the other end carried the precise diction of someone who'd practiced law for 40 years before retiring. Beverly and I have been discussing Hazel's situation. We'd like to come visit next week. Situation. She's fine, Warren. Thriving, actually. We heard about the support group falling apart. About you withdrawing from community commitments. We're concerned you might be overwhelmed. Garrett felt anger flash hot in his chest. I didn't withdraw. I had to step back temporarily while I dealt with my wife dying. There's a difference. Of course. Warren's tone suggested he was placating rather than understanding. We just want to make sure Hazel has adequate support. Beverly saw a wonderful program in Charleston, a residential school for deaf children with excellent outcomes. Hazel is 6 years old. She's not going to residential school halfway across the country. Now don't be hasty. This school has resources you can't provide on your own. Deaf teachers, deaf role models, a complete curriculum designed specifically for her needs. She has deaf role models. She has me learning sign language. She has a community here, a school where she's included and supported. Garrett's hands were shaking now, fury and fear mixing into something volatile. You're not taking my daughter from me. Nobody said anything about taking her. We're discussing what's best for Hazel, which should be your priority too. It is my priority. It's my only priority. And what's best for her is staying with her father in the home she knows with the routines she depends on. Not being shipped off because her grandparents think I'm not capable. Warren was quiet for a moment. Beverly and I will arrive Tuesday. We'll stay through the weekend. We can discuss this in person like civilized adults. Fine. Garrett ended the call without goodbye, his chest heaving with adrenaline he had no outlet for. Through the glass door he could see Rowan watching him with concern. Hazel was still absorbed in her excavation project, oblivious to the conversation that had just threatened her entire world. Garrett stood frozen, trying to remember the breathing exercises his grief counselor had taught him, trying not to spiral into catastrophic thinking about lawyers and custody battles and losing the only family he had left. The door slid open. Rowan stepped through her presence, solid and grounding. What happened, Juliet's parents? They're coming next week. They think I'm failing Hazel, that she'd be better off at some residential school in Charleston. Are they right? The question landed like a slap. Garrett spun toward her, ready to defend himself, but Rowan's expression held no judgment, only genuine inquiry. Of course they're not right. Hazel belongs with me. Then you tell them that. Rowan moved closer, her hands calm and certain as they shaped words. You show them the life you've built for her. The sign language you learned, the community you're rebuilding, the Saturday mornings where she's so happy she glows. You don't defend yourself like you've done something wrong. You simply demonstrate the truth. What if they don't believe the truth? What if they decide I'm not enough and they have the resources to fight me? Then you fight back. But first you stop assuming you're going to lose. Rowan's gaze held his, steady and unwavering. You're not some incompetent single father barely keeping things together. You're a man who shows up for his daughter every single day in ways that matter. Warren and Beverly are grieving their daughter, and that's making them grasp for control where they can't have it. But Hazel isn't Juliet. She's her own person, and she needs her father, not her grandparents' guilt. The clarity of it cut through Garrett's panic. Rowan was right. This wasn't about Hazel's welfare, not really. This was about Warren and Beverly trying to preserve some piece of their daughter by controlling her child. It was grief expressing itself as concern, fear masquerading as practicality. Will you be here, he asked. When they visit? I know that's asking a lot, but I can't. I'll be here, Rowan interrupted. Whatever you need. Saturday breakfast, support group, planning, moral support during the in-law invasion. I'm here. Why? The question came out more raw than he'd intended. Why are you doing this? You barely know us? I know enough. Rowan's hands moved slowly, each sign deliberate. I know Hazel deserves to stay with her father. I know you're doing the hard work of loving her through grief and uncertainty. And I know what it feels like to have people dismiss your capability because they can't see past perceived limitations. So yes, I'll be here because someone should have been there for me 9 years ago, and maybe this is how I pay that forward. Garrett felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking but expanding. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen me deal with judgmental grandparents. I can be extremely professional and extremely pointed at the same time. Despite everything, Garrett found himself laughing. That sounds terrifying. It should be. Rowan smiled, then sobered. But seriously, you've got this. And if you don't, we've got this. You're not alone anymore, Garrett. Stop acting like you have to be. The words settled into him like seeds finding soil foreign but with potential for growth. He'd been alone for so long, had armored himself in self-reliance because depending on others meant risking the pain of loss. But Rowan was offering something different. Not romance with all its attendant complications, but partnership. Solidarity. The simple revolutionary act of showing up. Hazel came running over, her hands full of rocks and her face alight with discovery. Look, I found 3 different kinds of quartz. She spread her treasures on the patio table, launching into detailed explanations of crystalline structure that she'd learned from library books. Rowan listened with complete attention, asking questions that demonstrated actual interest rather than polite engagement. Garrett watched them together. His daughter and this woman who'd entered their lives through circumstance and stayed through choice and felt the future shift from something to be endured into something that might hold possibility. Tuesday arrived too quickly. Garrett cleaned the house with more attention than usual, changed sheets in the guest room, stocked the refrigerator with foods he remembered Beverly liking. Hazel sensed his anxiety and became clingy, asking repeatedly why Grandma and Grandpa were visiting when it wasn't Christmas or her birthday. They miss us, Garrett signed, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. They want to spend time with you, but they always make you sad. The observation pierced him. I'm not sad, just nervous. They're Mommy's parents, so I want everything to be perfect. Hazel studied his face with the penetrating gaze children developed when their parents tried to lie to them. You're scared they'll be mad at you. No point in denying what she'd already intuited. A little bit, yes. But everything will be fine. We'll have a nice visit, and then they'll go home and things will go back to normal. Will Rowan still come for breakfast? Of course. Nothing changes about our Saturdays. But Hazel looked uncertain, and Garrett realized his daughter had already learned that promises about permanence couldn't always be kept. Her mother had promised to get better, and then she'd died. Life had taught her that normal was temporary, that change arrived without warning. Warren and Beverly's rental car pulled into the driveway at 3 o'clock precisely, German engineering and Charleston money announcing their arrival. Garrett took a breath, squeezed Hazel's shoulder, and opened the front door. Beverly emerged first, impeccably dressed in linen despite the flight, her silver hair styled in a way that suggested professional intervention. She moved like someone perpetually aware of being observed, posture perfect, smile practiced. Warren followed, taller and broader than Garrett, remembered his handshake firm to the point of aggression. Hazel Beverly signed with the careful precision of someone who'd learned the language from books rather than practice. You've grown so much. She pulled her granddaughter into a hug that Hazel tolerated rather than returned. Warren ruffled her hair in the gesture of men who'd never quite learned how to interact with small children. They moved into the house carrying overnight bags and the weight of evaluation, their gazes cataloging every detail, every piece of evidence that could support their predetermined conclusion. The house looks good, Warren allowed, though his tone suggested he'd expected otherwise. You're keeping up with maintenance. I'm keeping up with everything, Garrett replied, trying not to sound defensive. Beverly had moved to the mantel, studying the photographs arranged there with particular attention to Juliet's urn. You still keep her ashes here in the main living area? Yes. Hazel likes being able to talk to her mother. We light a candle every evening. Have you considered a memorial garden? Something more permanent. Beverly's suggestion carried the weight of criticism disguised as helpfulness. Garrett felt his jaw tighten. This is what works for us. The first evening passed in stilted conversation and careful observation. Beverly watched how Garrett communicated with Hazel, how he prepared dinner, how he managed bedtime routine. Warren asked pointed questions about Hazel's education plan, her therapy schedule, her social development. Every answer Garrett provided felt like testimony in a trial where he hadn't been informed of the charges. By Wednesday morning, the tension had crystallized into something harder to ignore. Beverly wanted to take Hazel shopping for new clothes, suggesting none of her current wardrobe fit properly. Warren had questions about Garrett's work schedule, how he managed childcare during project deadlines, whether he'd considered hiring a full-time nanny. "She doesn't need a nanny," Garrett said with forced patience. "She has after-school care 3 days a week, and I work from home the other 2. We have a system that works." "But what about Summer?" Beverly pressed. "You can't work full-time and supervise a 6-year-old for 3 months. She goes to day camp. Same one she attended last year. They're equipped to handle children with hearing aids, have staff trained in basic sign language." "Basic sign language," Warren repeated. "Not fluent signers. She's not profoundly deaf yet. She can communicate verbally with support." Garrett felt himself getting defensive despite Rowan's advice about demonstrating rather than defending. "And when her hearing deteriorates further, we'll adapt. That's what we do." Beverly and Warren exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that came from 45 years of marriage. "We've been researching options," Beverly said carefully. "The Charleston School for the Deaf has programs specifically designed for children Hazel's age. Small class sizes, deaf educators, comprehensive services." "We've discussed this," Garrett said flatly. "Hazel isn't going to residential school. Just visit with us." Warren pulled out glossy brochures from his briefcase. "See what they offer. Make an informed decision. I've made my decision. Hazel stays with me." Even if it's not what's best for her, Beverly's question carried decades of maternal authority, the assumption that her judgment superseded his parenting choices. Garrett stood abruptly, needing distance from their calm certainty that they knew better than he did what his daughter needed. "Excuse me, I need some air." He escaped to the back deck, the afternoon sun harsh after the dim interior. His phone was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to text Rowan. "They're here. It's worse than I thought. They want to send Hazel away." Her response came within seconds. "Breathe. Remember what you know to be true. Want me to come over?" "Not yet. But Saturday, please. I need them to see we have community support. That I'm not doing this alone. I'll be there. Hang in there." The sliding door opened. Warren stepped out, closing it behind him with deliberate care. "Beverly is putting Hazel down for a rest, though your daughter insists she doesn't nap anymore. She doesn't. She'll just lie there restless for an hour." Garrett didn't turn around, couldn't face his father-in-law without the anger he'd been suppressing showing clearly on his face. "We're not the enemy, Garrett." Warren's voice softened fractionally. "We loved Juliet. We love Hazel. We want what's best for our granddaughter." "So do I. And what's best is staying in her home with her father." Warren was quiet for a moment. "Juliet told us near the end that she was worried about you, about how you'd cope with single parenting and Hazel's hearing loss simultaneously. She told me she trusted me, that she knew I'd figure it out. Perhaps she said different things to different people." The implication hit like acid. "Or perhaps you're remembering what you want to remember because it supports taking Hazel from me. Nobody wants to take her. We want to ensure she has opportunities you can't provide alone. Resources, community stability. I'm providing all of that." Garrett spun to face Warren, now abandoning any pretense of calm. "I learned sign language. I'm rebuilding the support group. I have her in excellent schools with accommodations she needs. I show up every single day, even when it's hard, even when I'm exhausted, because that's what fathers do." "And what happens when you burn out? When the demands become too much?" Warren's expression was genuinely concerned, which somehow made it worse. "You're one person, Garrett. One grieving person trying to be everything. That's not sustainable. Watch me." They stared at each other across the deck, two men who'd never quite understood each other even when Juliet was alive to bridge the gap. Warren retreated first, going back inside with shoulders that suggested defeat rather than surrender. Garrett stayed outside until the sun started setting, watching shadows lengthen across the overgrown garden, trying to remember what Rowan had said about demonstrating truth rather than defending against accusations. Thursday and Friday passed in similar patterns. Beverly found fault with small things, the way Garrett packed Hazel's lunch, his decision to let her watch television before bed, the casual mess of lived-in spaces. Warren asked questions disguised as conversation, gathering evidence for arguments Garrett knew were being constructed in private discussions he wasn't invited to join. By Friday evening, Garrett was stretched thin, his patience eroded by constant evaluation. Hazel had grown quiet, sensing the tension, her normally effervescent personality dimmed by the weight of adult conflict she couldn't fully understand. Saturday morning arrived like reprieve. Rowan texted at 8:30, "On my way." Made extra muffins to share with the grandparents. Game face on. Garrett felt his shoulders relax fractionally. He'd told Warren and Beverly about their Saturday tradition, framed it as community involvement and Hazel's social development. They'd agreed to meet Rowan with the kind of polite interest that barely masked skepticism. She arrived at 9, precisely carrying a basket of muffins and wearing confidence like armor. Garrett made introductions with careful formality, watching Warren and Beverly assess this new variable in their equation. "You're the nurse Hazel talks about?" Beverly said, her tone pleasant but cool. "From the hospital." "And the support group co-facilitator," Rowan added smoothly. "Garrett and I have been working together to rebuild resources for families navigating childhood hearing loss." She signed as she spoke, fluid and natural. "It's important for Hazel to see adults successfully living with deafness." "You're deaf," Warren stated the observation, hovering between question and confirmation. "Hard of hearing, yes. Moderate to severe loss. I wear hearing aids, same as Hazel will likely need as her condition progresses." Rowan's directness left no room for euphemism or pity. "And you work full-time?" "Manage independently." Beverly's questions carried subtext about capability and limitation. "I do. Pediatric nursing requires quick thinking and clear communication. My deafness has never been an obstacle to providing excellent patient care. If anything, it allows me to connect with young patients who have disabilities in ways hearing nurses might not." Hazel had attached herself to Rowan's side, her usual enthusiasm returning in the presence of someone she trusted. "Can we show Grandma and Grandpa my room? I organized my rock collection by mineral type." "That sounds educational," Warren allowed, and they trooped down the hallway, Hazel chattering while Beverly and Warren observed with the focused attention of anthropologists studying unfamiliar culture. Garrett and Rowan stayed in the kitchen preparing breakfast with coordinated efficiency born of weeks of practice. "You're doing great," she signed when they were alone. "They're evaluating you, but you're solid. Don't let them see doubt." "I'm made of doubt right now." "Then fake it. Performance is 90% of competence anyway." Over breakfast, Rowan engaged Warren and Beverly with professional polish, answering their questions about deaf education and cochlear implants and accommodation strategies. She spoke about the support group plans, the families already expressing interest, the need for community-based resources rather than institutional solutions. She mentioned Garrett's dedication, Hazel's progress, the clear bond between father and daughter that couldn't be quantified on assessment forms. "It's impressive what you've built here," Beverly said to Garrett, though her tone suggested surprise rather than approval. "We weren't aware you had this level of support." "Because you didn't ask," Garrett thought, but didn't sign. "Because you assumed I was failing and built your conclusions from that assumption." "Hazel is lucky to have multiple deaf role models," Rowan continued. "Research shows that deaf children with access to deaf adults develop stronger self-esteem and identity formation. Residential schools have value, certainly, but so does growing up in an inclusive environment where deafness is normalized rather than treated as something requiring institutional intervention." Warren leaned back in his chair, studying Rowan with lawyer's calculation. "You seem very invested in this family's welfare. Is this professional interest or something more?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Garrett felt his spine stiffen, ready to defend or deflect, but Rowan answered without hesitation. "Both, actually. Professionally, I want Hazel to have the resources she deserves. Personally, I care about this family because they've become important to me." "Is that inappropriate in your assessment?" "Not inappropriate," Warren allowed. "Just worth noting for context." Context for what Garrett asked, his voice sharper than intended. "For understanding the full situation." Beverly's hands rested on the table, perfectly manicured, utterly composed. "We want what's best for Hazel. That includes understanding everyone involved in her care." The subtext was clear. They thought Rowan was biasing Garrett's judgment that her involvement represented instability rather than support. Garrett felt fury rising in his throat, but Rowan's hand found his under the table, squeezed once in warning or solidarity. The rest of breakfast passed in careful conversation topics chosen for neutrality. Conflict avoided through mutual agreement to table difficult discussions. Hazel monopolized Rowan's attention, oblivious to the adult tensions swirling around her excavation site explanations. After Rowan left, promising to return the following Saturday, regardless of whether grandparents were still in residence, Beverly and Warren requested a private conversation. They settled in the living room, the three adults arranged in careful triangle while Hazel played in her room. "We've discussed Hazel's situation extensively," Warren began. "And we want to propose a compromise." Garrett waited, already knowing he wouldn't like whatever came next. "Summer in Charleston," Beverly continued. "She could attend the day program at the deaf school, get exposure to their methods and community, just for 3 months. See how she responds to that environment?" "Absolutely not." Garrett's response came without hesitation. "She stays with me. That's not negotiable. Garrett, be reasonable." Warren's patience was wearing thin. "This isn't about removing her permanently. It's about giving her opportunities to thrive. She is thriving. Here, with me." Garrett stood, needing the advantage of height. "I understand you're grieving Juliet. I understand you want to feel connected to your granddaughter. But I'm not sending her away because you think I'm not capable of raising her alone. And when you meet someone," Beverly's question carried edges sharp enough to draw blood. "When you start dating again, focusing on building a new relationship, will Hazel still be your priority?" The accusation was clear. They'd seen Rowan had interpreted her presence as romantic involvement, had decided Garrett was choosing personal happiness over paternal responsibility. "My daughter will always be my priority." "The fact that you'd question that shows how little you understand about who I am." "We understand you're lonely." Beverly said, something almost like sympathy creeping into her voice. "We understand the burden of single parenting. Let us help by giving Hazel summer enrichment while you take time for yourself." "I don't need time for myself. I need you to trust me with my own child." Garrett's voice was rising now, control slipping. "I need you to stop treating me like I'm failing when I'm doing everything humanly possible to give Hazel a good life." Warren stood as well, matching Garrett's height advantage with the authority of age and certainty. "We'll be watching Garrett closely. If we see any indication that Hazel's welfare is being compromised, any sign that your personal life is interfering with her care, we won't hesitate to pursue legal options." "Get out." Garrett's hands were shaking. "Get out of my house." Beverly started, but Garrett cut her off. "You accused me of neglecting my daughter because I have a friend who helps with community building. You threatened legal action because I won't send her away for the summer. You've spent 4 days cataloging my failures instead of seeing how hard I'm working. So yes, I want you to leave, now." They left Sunday morning 2 days earlier than planned, the air thick with things unsaid and accusations barely leashed. Beverly hugged Hazel with trembling hands. Warren pressed business cards for Charleston lawyers into Garrett's palm with meaningful eye contact. The rental car pulled away, carrying judgment and grief and the lingering threat of future intervention. After they'd gone, Hazel climbed into Garrett's lap on the couch, her small body fitting against his with the perfect trust of childhood. "Are Grandma and Grandpa mad at you? They're worried about you. Sometimes worry looks like anger. But I'm happy here. With you. And Rowan on Saturdays. And my school and my friends. I know, sweetheart. And you're staying right here. I promise." But even as he said it, Garrett felt the weight of Warren's threat pressing against his chest. Legal options. Custody challenges. The possibility that loving his daughter might not be enough to keep her if grandparents with resources decided his single-parent household wasn't adequate. His phone buzzed. "Rowan. How bad was it after I left?" Garrett looked at his daughter, at their home, at everything he stood to lose if he couldn't prove he was enough. Then he typed back, "Bad. They threatened legal action if they think Hazel's welfare is compromised. I might need more than breakfast support going forward." Rowan's response came immediately. "Then you'll have it, whatever you need. We're in this together now." The week after Warren and Beverly's departure passed in a fog of hypervigilance. Garrett documented everything: mealtimes, therapy appointments, Hazel's homework completion, her social interactions at school. He kept meticulous notes as if preparing for cross-examination evidence that his parenting met some undefined standard that would satisfy grandparents who'd already decided he was inadequate. Rowan noticed during their Wednesday phone call, her voice carrying concern across the digital distance. "You're spiraling. I can hear it in how you're talking, all facts and schedules and proof. Stop building a legal defense and just live with your daughter." What if living isn't enough? What if they're watching, waiting for me to make one mistake they can use against me? Then they'll be disappointed because you don't make mistakes with Hazel. You make choices, and sometimes those choices are imperfect, but that's called being human. Stop performing parenthood like it's a trial. But it felt like a trial. Every decision weighed against potential scrutiny. When Hazel asked to skip her Tuesday speech therapy because she was tired, Garrett said yes, and then spent the evening convinced Warren would somehow discover this lapse and add it to his catalog of paternal failures. When she fell and scraped her knee at the playground Thursday afternoon, Garrett documented the injury with photographs and incident reports as if Beverly might accuse him of neglect. Saturday morning arrived like sanctuary. Rowan appeared at 9 with banana chocolate chip muffins and an expression that suggested she'd come prepared for intervention. She took one look at Garrett's face and signed to Hazel. "Sweetheart, I brought a new dinosaur book for you. Why don't you start looking at it while your dad and I talk grown-up stuff for a few minutes?" Hazel accepted the book with enthusiasm, settling onto the couch with the focused attention she brought to anything involving prehistoric creatures. Rowan turned to Garrett with the no-nonsense directness he'd come to both appreciate and fear. "Kitchen. Now. Talk to me." They stood at the counter, coffee growing cold between them while Garrett tried to articulate the anxiety that had been building like pressure behind his sternum. "I can't stop thinking about what Warren said, about watching, about legal options. What if they're serious? What if they actually try to take her? Then you fight." "But Garrett, you can't live in constant fear of a threat that might never materialize. You'll exhaust yourself and damage Hazel in the process." "How would I damage her? I'm trying to protect her. By being so tightly wound, she feels like she has to be perfect to keep you from falling apart." Rowan's hands moved with careful precision. Children absorb their parents' anxiety. Hazel is navigating progressive hearing loss and the loss of her mother. She needs you to be stable, not performing stability while crumbling underneath. The accuracy of it landed like diagnosis. "I don't know how to be anything else right now." "Yes, you do. You were fine before Warren and Beverly showed up. You were building something good, rebuilding the support group, letting Hazel be a normal kid. Don't let their fear infect you." Garrett wanted to argue to defend his hypervigilance as reasonable response to real threat. But Rowan was right. He'd spent the week treating Hazel like evidence to be preserved rather than a daughter to be enjoyed, and she'd responded by becoming quieter, more careful, as if afraid her normal childhood chaos might somehow endanger their life together. "I'll try to relax." "Don't try. Do." Rowan softened slightly. "And maybe consider talking to your grief counselor again. The one you stopped seeing 4 months ago because you convinced yourself you were fine." "How do you know about that?" Hazel mentioned it. "Said you used to go talk to Dr. Chen every week and now you don't because you're all better." Her words delivered with 6-year-old certainty that adults tell children the truth. The revelation stung. "I'm not all better." "I know. Neither am I most days. That's why I still see my therapist every other week 9 years after my accident. Healing isn't linear, and grief doesn't have an expiration date." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Through the doorway, Hazel was signing to herself as she studied dinosaur illustrations, her small hands shaping words in the private language of thought. Watching her, Garrett felt the constriction around his ribs ease fractionally. This was what mattered, not Warren's judgment or Beverly's concern or the legal threats that might never materialize. Just this, his daughter safe and engaged and happy in their Saturday morning routine. "Okay," he signed finally. "I'll call Dr. Chen on Monday. Schedule appointments. And I'll stop documenting Hazel's life like she's a case study." "Good. Now make me terrible pancakes and let's have a normal breakfast." They did conversation flowing with the ease they'd developed over weeks of practice. Hazel dominated discussion with detailed explanations of brachiosaurus feeding habits and theories about asteroid impacts. Rowan asked follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest, while Garrett contributed occasional facts from architecture about structural engineering principles that might explain dinosaur skeletal support. After breakfast, Hazel wanted to show Rowan her latest drawings, which meant an hour in her room while Garrett cleaned the kitchen and tried to internalize Rowan's advice about relaxing into normal parenting. His phone buzzed with an email from the administrator at Children's Hospital where Rowan worked. The support group meeting space was confirmed for the first Saturday in June, 2 weeks away. They had 17 families registered so far, more than Garrett had dared hope for. He was reading through the list of attendees when Hazel's scream shattered the morning quiet. Not the theatrical screaming of childhood drama, but genuine terror, the sound no parent wanted to hear. Garrett dropped his phone and ran toward her room, adrenaline flooding his system. Rowan was already there, kneeling beside Hazel, who sat on the floor clutching her head, her face contorted with pain. One of her hearing aids lay on the carpet, the battery compartment cracked open, the delicate internal components exposed. "What happened?" Garrett signed, dropping to his knees beside his daughter. "It fell," Hazel signed through tears. "I was reaching for my high shelf, and it fell, and now it's broken, and I can't hear right, and everything sounds wrong." Rowan had already retrieved the damaged hearing aid, examining it with professional assessment. "The casing is cracked," she signed. "The receiver might be damaged. You'll need to take her to the audiologist." His throat closed. "It's Saturday. They're not open until Monday." "Then she goes without it until Monday?" Rowan signed calmly. "It's not ideal, but it's not an emergency. She still has the other one." "But what if Warren finds out? What if he uses this as proof? I'm negligent that Hazel isn't safe with me." Rowan's expression hardened, warmth replaced by something more direct. "Garrett, stop. Accidents happen. Children break things. This is not evidence of failure." But Hazel was crying harder now, her small body shaking with sobs that had escalated beyond the physical injury into something deeper. "Everything's breaking," she signed when she could form words again. "My ears are breaking and Mommy's gone and Grandma and Grandpa think Daddy can't take care of me, and now my hearing aid is broken too." The cascade of fears spilled out in the way of children finally articulating terrors they'd been holding inside. Garrett pulled her into his lap, rocking her while signing against her back where she could feel the movement even if she couldn't see the words. "Nothing is breaking that can't be fixed. Your hearing aid can be repaired or replaced. Your ears are changing, not breaking, and I can absolutely take care of you." "But what if you can't?" Hazel signed into his chest. "What if something happens to you like it happened to Mommy? And then I'm all alone." The fear every child of a dead parent carried, the terror of losing the remaining anchor to safety. Garrett felt Rowan's hand on his shoulder, grounding him while he tried to find words adequate to the moment. "Nothing is going to happen to me," he signed, though they both knew he couldn't promise that any more than Juliet had been able to promise she'd recover. "But if something... Did you have Grandma and Grandpa and Rowan and so many people who love you? You would never be alone." Hazel pulled back enough to look at him, her face blotchy with tears. "Promise Rowan won't leave. Promise she'll keep coming for pancakes." The question hung between them, innocent and impossible. Garrett looked at Rowan over his daughter's head, trying to communicate the weight of what Hazel was asking without putting pressure on someone who owed them nothing beyond the friendship she'd already offered. "I'm not going anywhere," Rowan signed directly to Hazel. "Saturday pancakes are my favorite part of the week. Plus, your dad needs someone to make sure his cooking doesn't get worse." Hazel managed a watery laugh. "His pancakes are pretty bad." "The worst," Rowan agreed. "But he tries very hard." The crisis passed gradually, Hazel's tears subsiding into hiccups and then into the exhausted calm that followed emotional storms. Rowan helped her clean up the broken hearing aid, placing it carefully in a case for the audiologist appointment. They adjusted the remaining hearing aid's volume to compensate partially for the lost input, though Hazel reported everything sounded strange, unbalanced. By afternoon she'd adapted with the resilience of childhood, playing in the backyard, with only occasional signs of frustration when she couldn't hear bird sounds or wind through the trees. Garrett watched from the deck, his coffee cold in his hands, while Rowan sat beside him in comfortable silence. "That was my fault," he said finally. "The way she spiraled about everything breaking. She's absorbing my anxiety about Warren and Beverly. Children are perceptive. They sense what adults try to hide." Rowan's gaze stayed on Hazel, who was building an elaborate stick structure she'd declared was a dinosaur habitat. "But they're also resilient. You acknowledged her fears, you reassured her, and you didn't dismiss her feelings as silly. That's good parenting. I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water most days. Most parents feel that way. The ones who don't are either lying or not paying attention." Garrett turned to look at her properly. This woman who'd become essential to their Saturdays, who signed to his daughter with perfect fluency and called him out when he spiraled into anxiety. "Why are you really doing this? Coming here every week, getting involved with our mess planning support groups with someone you met 2 months ago?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment. "You want the honest answer, please? Because I'm lonely too. Because 9 years after my accident, I've built a successful career and a functional life, but I go home to an empty apartment every night and wonder if this is all there is. Because I spent so long convinced my deafness made me unlovable that I forgot to look for other kinds of love. Friendship, community, chosen family." She paused, her hands still, before continuing. "And because when I'm here with you and Hazel, I feel like I'm part of something that matters. Not as a project or a charity case, but as a person whose presence adds value. That's rare enough to be precious." The vulnerability of it took Garrett's breath. "You add value." He signed the words inadequate to the gratitude he felt. "You've helped rebuild something I thought was permanently broken. Not just the support group, but the possibility of letting people in again. You did that yourself. I just showed up and stayed. Showing up matters. Staying matters more." They sat in companionable silence, watching Hazel construct her dinosaur world with the focused determination she brought to projects that captured her imagination. The afternoon sun slanted across the overgrown garden, illuminating the wild roses Juliet had planted, the forget-me-nots, spreading their blue flowers across every available surface. "I need to tell you something," Garrett said, the words coming before he'd fully decided to speak them. "About Juliet. About the end." Rowan turned toward him, giving him her full attention without demanding he continue. "She made me promise not to rage against Hazel's hearing loss, not to waste energy fighting something we couldn't change. She said adaptation with grace was more important than bitter resistance. And I've tried, I really have, but some days I'm so angry at the universe for giving my daughter this additional burden on top of losing her mother. That's not breaking your promise. That's being human. But I'm supposed to be the stable one, the parent who has everything figured out. How can I show Hazel grace when I'm drowning in resentment at circumstances beyond anyone's control? Maybe grace isn't about not feeling anger. Maybe it's about feeling it and choosing not to let it define you." Rowan's hands moved slowly, deliberately. "You're allowed to grieve the hearing your daughter is losing. You're allowed to rage at cancer and genetic conditions and drunk drivers and every unfair thing that's happened to your family. What matters is what you do with those feelings. What am I supposed to do with them? Feel them. Process them in therapy instead of swallowing them until they poison everything. Show Hazel that adults have hard emotions too, but we don't let them control our choices." Garrett absorbed this, testing the permission against years of conditioning that men shouldn't express emotion, that fathers needed to be rocks for their children. But rocks eroded eventually under enough pressure, wearing down into nothing useful. The following week brought the audiologist appointment, where Garrett learned the hearing aid could be repaired but would take 2 weeks, and Hazel would need to function with only one device in the interim. The audiologist also delivered news Garrett had been dreading. Hazel's hearing had deteriorated faster than previous projections suggested. They were looking at profound deafness within 2 years, rather than the 5 to 7 originally estimated. He sat in his car in the parking lot after the appointment, Hazel buckled in the back seat, examining the temporary loaner hearing aid with clinical interest, while he tried to process information that felt like verdict and timeline. 2 years, 24 months before his daughter would live in complete silence. His phone rang. Rowan's number. He answered without thinking about whether he was ready for conversation. How did it go? The question undid him. Before he could stop himself, he was crying in the front seat of his car, while Hazel watched with concerned eyes, and Rowan listened on the other end of the line to his explanation of accelerated timeline and permanent silence approaching faster than expected. "I'm sorry," he managed finally. "I shouldn't dump this on you." "Yes, you should. That's what people who care about each other do." Rowan's voice was steady, anchoring. "Where are you now, parking lot?" "Children's Hospital North Building. Stay there. I'm coming down." "You're working. I'm on break. Stay there." She appeared 10 minutes later, still wearing her scrubs, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she favored for 12-hour shifts. She opened the passenger door and slid in without asking permission, her presence immediately making the confined space feel less suffocating. "Hi, Hazel," she signed toward the back seat. "Your dad told me about the hearing aid situation. That must be frustrating. It feels weird with only one Hazel signed back, like trying to listen through water." "That's a good description." Rowan turned to Garrett. "You going to be okay eventually?" "Right now I'm just trying not to think about 2 years from now." "Then don't. Think about today. Today Hazel is here. She's healthy. She's adapting. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. You can't solve them all in advance. I want to. I want to fix everything before it breaks." Rowan's hand found his on the center console, her fingers lacing through his with casual intimacy that should have felt presumptuous but instead felt like relief. Life doesn't work that way. You adapt in the moment, not in anticipation of future moments you can't predict. Garrett looked at their joined hands, trying to remember the last time he'd held hands with someone other than Hazel. Years, certainly. Before Juliet got sick and touch became associated with medical procedures and pain management. This felt different, chosen rather than desperate comfort, rather than clinging. "Thank you," he signed with his free hand, "for showing up." Always, Rowan signed back, "For as long as you need me." The first support group meeting happened on a Saturday evening in early June. The hospital conference room arranged with chairs in a circle and fidget toys for children scattered on side tables. 17 families had registered. 14 actually appeared, bringing with them the particular exhaustion of parents navigating childhood disability. Garrett stood at the front of the room, his prepared remarks suddenly inadequate to the reality of all these faces looking to him for guidance he wasn't sure he possessed. Beside him, Rowan projected calm competence, and when he froze, she stepped forward smoothly. "Thank you all for coming," she signed and spoke simultaneously. "My name is Rowan Ashford. I'm a pediatric nurse here at Children's Hospital and I'm deaf. This is Garrett Sullivan. He's an architect and father to a daughter with progressive hearing loss. Together, we're hoping to create a community where families like ours can share resources, support each other, and remember we're not alone in this journey." The room relaxed fractionally. Parents introduced themselves and their children, each family carrying their own variation of the same story: diagnosis, fear adaptation, the constant navigation of systems not designed for their needs. A mother of 8-year-old twins, both profoundly deaf from birth. A father whose son had lost his hearing to meningitis at age 4. A couple whose daughter was dealing with the same progressive condition as Hazel, the same uncertain timeline. Garrett found his voice eventually sharing his experience of learning sign language, building accommodations, fighting school systems for proper support. Other parents contributed their own strategies, their failures and successes, and slowly the meeting transformed from presentation into conversation. Children played in the adjacent room under volunteer supervision, while adults talked with the desperate relief of people who'd been isolated too long. During the break, a woman approached Garrett with a toddler on her hip. "You're the one who ran this group before, right?" 3 years ago. Garrett recognized her vaguely, though her name escaped him. "I did, yes. Before my wife got sick. We came to 2 meetings. They saved us honestly. Then you stopped and we were lost again." The woman shifted her daughter to her other hip. "I'm so glad you're doing this again. We need it." The gratitude felt unearned given how he'd abandoned the group when his own life became unmanageable. But maybe that was the point. Everyone here was doing their best, with impossible circumstances failing, sometimes succeeding occasionally, mostly just surviving day to day. Rowan found him after the meeting ended, helping him stack chairs while the last families trickled out. That went well, she signed. People were engaged, sharing openly. You did good. We did good. I would have frozen completely without you. Partners then. Rowan's smile carried warmth that made his pulse quicken. We make a good team. Partnership. The concept resonated simple and true. When had they become a team? Somewhere between Saturday pancakes and support group planning and phone calls when he was falling apart in parking lots. Somewhere in the accumulated small moments of showing up for each other. Over the following weeks, the support group established rhythm. Meetings every other Saturday evening with auxiliary activities during off weeks, parent coffee meetups, sign language practice sessions for children, advocacy workshops for navigating educational systems. The group grew to 23 families, then 28, then 35. Garrett and Rowan divided responsibilities, playing to their respective strengths, building something that felt sustainable rather than burdensome. Hazel thrived in the environment, making friends with other deaf and hard-of-hearing children, seeing herself reflected in a community rather than isolated by difference. Her confidence bloomed, her signing became more fluent, and the anxiety that had characterized the weeks after her grandparents' visit gradually dissipated. Garrett returned to therapy as promised, meeting with Dr. Chen every week to excavate grief he'd been avoiding for 2 years. It was harder than he'd expected, peeling back layers of functional coping to expose the raw wounds underneath. Some sessions left him wrung out and fragile, but he always felt Rowan's presence as safety net, knowing he could text her if he needed grounding, and she'd respond with either wisdom or terrible puns, depending on what the moment required. July arrived with heat that transformed Portland from perpetually damp to unexpectedly scorching. Garrett took Hazel to the coast for a long weekend, just the two of them in a rental cottage where they built sand castles and searched for agates and talked about Juliet without the conversations feeling heavy or obligatory. On their last evening, sitting on the beach watching sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Hazel turned to him with serious expression. "Are you and Rowan dating?" The question caught Garrett completely off guard. "What? No. We're friends." "Why would you think we're dating?" "Because you smile at her, the way Mommy said you used to smile at her when you were first in love." Hazel's hands moved with matter-of-fact observation. "And because she looks at you like you're important. That's what dating looks like. We're just friends, sweetheart. Good friends who care about each other, but that's different from dating." Hazel absorbed this with the skepticism children developed early regarding adult explanations. "Okay, but if you did want to date her, I would be okay with it. I think Mommy would be okay with it too." The permission offered with childhood gravity made Garrett's throat tight. "Thank you, baby. That means a lot." But he thought about it that night after Hazel had fallen asleep, listening to the ocean's rhythm through open windows. Did he want to date Rowan? The question felt enormous and terrifying in equal measure. He cared about her, certainly, looked forward to their time together, relied on her perspective, felt more himself in her presence than he had in years. But wanting and being ready were different things, and grief had taught him that feelings didn't always arrive on convenient timelines. Back in Portland, Saturday breakfasts continued into August. Hazel's birthday approached, and they planned a party that would include her deaf friends from the support group and classmates from school who'd learned basic signs to communicate with her. Rowan helped organize everything, decorating with a dinosaur theme Hazel had requested, coordinating games that worked for hearing and deaf children equally. Warren called the night before the party, his voice carrying across the phone line with the careful neutrality that suggested he was choosing words deliberately. "Beverly and I would like to attend Hazel's birthday celebration if you'll permit it." Garrett's first instinct was refusal, protecting his daughter's special day from grandparents who'd threatened his custody. But Rowan had been coaching him on extending grace even when it felt undeserved, on modeling forgiveness for Hazel's benefit. "You're welcome to come," he said finally. "The party is at 2 o'clock at our house. It's dinosaur-themed. We'll be there." Warren paused, then added, "We've been thinking about what you said, about trust. We'd like to discuss that when we see you. Okay, we can talk. They arrived bearing an expensive microscope for examining fossils, Beverly's anxiety evident in how she clutched her purse and Warren's stiffness visible in his formal attire wildly inappropriate for a children's birthday party. But they made effort signing happy birthday to Hazel, engaging with other parents, observing without judgment as Garrett and Rowan coordinated activities with practiced teamwork. During cake, Warren pulled Garrett aside onto the deck. You've built something impressive here. The support group, the community. We weren't aware of the extent of your network. Because you didn't ask, Garrett thought again, but this time he said it aloud. You assumed I was failing and looked for evidence to support that assumption, instead of asking what my life actually looked like. Warren absorbed this, his jaw working. You're right. We were scared of losing Hazel the way we lost Juliet. That fear made us controlling instead of supportive. The admission cost him something, Garrett could see that. Warren Caldwell didn't apologize easily, didn't admit error without internal struggle. I understand that fear. I live with it every day. But I need you to trust that I'm capable of raising my daughter even when circumstances are hard. Garrett's hands remained steady despite his racing heart. I need you to stop threatening legal action every time you disagree with my choices. We spoke with an attorney, Warren admitted, about custody options. But after watching you this afternoon, seeing Hazel thriving and happy, we've decided that's not a path we want to pursue. Garrett exhaled slowly, tension draining from his shoulders. Thank you. We'd like to be part of her life, though. Regular visits, video calls, involvement in major decisions. Can we find a way to do that without conflict? Yes. Garrett found himself meaning it. Hazel should know her grandparents. She should hear stories about her mother from people who knew Juliet longer than I did. I just need you to respect that I'm her father and final decisions rest with me. Agreed. Warren extended his hand and Garrett shook it, feeling years of tension dissipate into something resembling truce, if not quite peace. Inside, Rowan was teaching a group of children the sign for dinosaur, while Hazel demonstrated various species-specific variations she'd invented. Beverly approached Garrett and Warren on the deck, her expression cautious. That young woman, Rowan. She's very good with the children. She's wonderful with Hazel specifically, Garrett confirmed. She's become important to our family. Are you in love with her? Beverly's question was direct characteristic of a woman who'd spent 45 years asking hard questions without preamble. Garrett considered lying, deflecting, protecting himself from vulnerability. But dishonesty would only delay inevitable conversations. I don't know, he admitted. I care about her deeply, but I'm not sure I'm ready for whatever comes after caring. Juliet wouldn't want you to be alone forever, Beverly said quietly. She told me once that if anything happened to her, she hoped you'd find someone who made you happy, someone who understood about Hazel and loved her too. She said that in the hospital near the end. She made me promise not to stand in your way if you met someone, said you were the kind of man who needed partnership, who thrived in relationship rather than solitude. Garrett felt tears threatening, blinked them back. I miss her so much still. Some days it's like she died yesterday instead of 2 years ago. Missing her and loving someone new aren't mutually exclusive. Beverly's hand found his shoulder, awkward but genuine. The heart expands, Garrett. It doesn't replace. Inside, the party continued with raucous joy, children hopped up on sugar and celebration, adults laughing at the chaos. Garrett watched through the glass door as Rowan helped Hazel open presents, signing running commentary that made his daughter giggle. She fit here, he realized, not as guest or helper, but as integral part of the fabric of their lives. That evening, after Warren and Beverly had departed with promises of monthly video calls and Christmas in Charleston after the last guests had collected their exhausted children and left behind crumpled wrapping paper and half-eaten cake, Garrett sat on the couch while Hazel showed Rowan each gift with detailed explanation of its significance. Watching them together, their heads bent over the fossil microscope, signing with casual fluency, he felt understanding arrive with sudden clarity. This was what he wanted. Not someday, not eventually, but now. This specific woman, this specific life they'd been building in increments too small to notice until suddenly the structure was undeniable. But wanting and declaring were different things, and Garrett had no idea how to bridge that gap without risking everything they'd already established. Hazel eventually succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep on the couch mid-sentence, her small body going boneless the way children did when consciousness finally surrendered. Garrett carried her to bed, tucking her in with the weighted blanket and the stuffed brachiosaurus she'd named Gregory and refused to sleep without. When he returned to the living room, Rowan was cleaning up the last remnants of party chaos, consolidating paper plates into trash bags with practiced efficiency. "You don't have to do that. I know. But I want to." She glanced up from her work. "That was a good party." Hazel was radiant. She was. "Thank you for making it happen. I would have ordered grocery store cake and called it sufficient." Grocery store cake is perfectly sufficient. But themed decorations and coordinated games made her feel special. Every kid deserves to feel special on their birthday. They worked in companionable silence, restoring order to the chaos of celebration. When the house was clean and the dishwasher loaded, they gravitated to the deck, the summer evening still warm enough for outdoor sitting, the garden now wild enough to feel intentional rather than neglected. "Warren and Beverly seem better," Rowan observed. "Less hostile, anyway. They apologized, admitted they'd let fear make them controlling. We've agreed to regular contact and mutual respect. That's progress. Real progress." Garrett nodded, his gaze on the wild roses illuminated by porch light. "They asked if I was in love with you." The statement hung in the air between them. Rowan went very still, her hands frozen mid-sign. "What did you tell them?" "That I didn't know. That I cared about you but wasn't sure I was ready for whatever comes after caring." Garrett forced himself to look at her directly, reading her expression in the dim light. "That was the coward's answer. What's the brave answer?" His pulse hammered in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to retreat, to protect himself from the possibility of loss by refusing to risk love again. But he thought about Juliet's video message about showing Hazel what courage looked like, about Rowan's observation that grace meant choosing action despite fear. "The brave answer is that I think I'm falling in love with you. That you've become essential to my life and Hazel's life in ways I can't imagine navigating without. That the thought of Saturday mornings without you feels like losing something precious. That I'm terrified because everyone I've loved has either left or died, but I'm more terrified of letting fear prevent me from choosing you." The words spilled out in a rush sign language and spoken English tangling together, his hands trembling with the vulnerability of complete honesty. Rowan's expression remained unreadable for a long moment, and Garrett felt panic rising. He'd miscalculated, had destroyed their friendship by wanting more, had proven Warren right about personal life interfering with Hazel's stability. Then Rowan was moving, closing the distance between them, her hands finding his face with gentle precision. "I'm falling in love with you too. Have been for weeks, maybe months. But I didn't know if you were ready, if Juliet's memory was too big to make space for something new." "Her memory is big," Garrett confirmed. "It always will be. But Beverly said something today about hearts expanding rather than replacing. I think she's right. I think I can love Juliet and miss Juliet and still love you. They're not competing feelings. No, they're not." Rowan's thumb traced his cheekbone, wiping away tears he hadn't realized were falling. "I'm not trying to replace her. I couldn't if I wanted to. I'm just trying to be present for this version of your life, the one that exists now. That's all I need. Presence, partnership, someone who sees us clearly and chooses to stay." Rowan kissed him, then soft and careful, a question more than a declaration. Garrett kissed her back, his hands finding her waist, pulling her closer, and it felt like coming home and stepping into unknown territory simultaneously. When they pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Rowan's smile was radiant. "So, we're doing this, actually dating instead of just pretending we're only friends. We're doing this. Though we should probably talk to Hazel first, make sure she's genuinely okay with it despite her earlier permission. She'll be thrilled. She's been not so subtly trying to matchmake us for weeks." Rowan settled against him, her head on his shoulder, their joined hands resting on his knee. "We'll take it slow, figure things out as we go. No pressure to define anything before we're ready." They sat like that until the stars became visible through Portland's light pollution, talking in fragments about logistics and feelings and the strange miracle of finding each other through circumstance that had started with cruelty. Garrett felt lighter than he had in years, the constant anxiety loosened by hope and possibility. Inside, his phone buzzed with a text from Warren. "Thank you for letting us be part of today. You're a good father, Garrett. Juliet would be proud." The acknowledgement mattered more than Garrett wanted to admit. He showed the message to Rowan, who squeezed his hand in silent solidarity. September brought new routines. Rowan stayed over occasionally on Friday nights, joining their Saturday morning ritual from the previous evening, rather than arriving at 9. She maintained her own apartment, preserving independence they both valued, but her presence in Garrett's house became more frequent, more natural. Her toothbrush appeared in the bathroom, her favorite coffee in the kitchen cabinet, her clothes mixed among his in the laundry. They told Hazel first, who responded with enthusiastic signing of, "I knew it," and demands to know if Rowan would move in immediately. They explained about taking things slowly, about how relationships developed over time, but Hazel had already decided and merely tolerated their adult need for process. The support group absorbed the news with varying reactions. Some families celebrated, appreciating the visible proof that deaf adults could find love and partnership. Others withdrew, slightly discomforted by leadership that was romantically involved. Garrett and Rowan addressed concerns head-on, establishing clear boundaries between personal relationship and professional facilitation, making space for discomfort while maintaining the group's core purpose. Hazel's hearing continued its progressive decline. By October, her remaining hearing aid provided minimal benefit. The audiologist recommended beginning cochlear implant evaluation, a process that would take months and require surgery. Garrett had been dreading since diagnosis, but Rowan attended every appointment, researched options, connected them with adult cochlear implant users who could speak to the reality beyond medical brochures. In late October, Garrett proposed. Not marriage, not yet, but commitment. He gave Rowan a key to his house and asked her to officially move in to build life together intentionally rather than through accumulated Friday sleepovers. They were sitting on the deck, wrapped in blankets against autumn chill, when he pulled the key from his pocket. "I want you here," he signed. "Not visiting, not occasionally staying over. Here, with us, building this life together." Rowan took the key, her eyes bright. "You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. You've already been part of our family for months. I'm just asking you to make it official." She kissed him instead of answering, which was answer enough. "Yes," she signed when they pulled apart. "Yes, to all of it." They told Hazel together the next morning, both nervous about how she'd process the change. But his daughter just signed finally and went back to her dinosaur drawings, as if she'd been waiting for adults to catch up to what she'd known for months. Warren and Beverly sent congratulations via video call, Beverly admitting she'd hoped for exactly this outcome since the birthday party. They maintained their promised regular contact monthly video calls, where Hazel showed them her latest projects and Garrett shared updates about support group growth and cochlear implant decisions. By mid-November, Rowan had fully moved in. The process took 2 weeks, her belongings integrated into spaces Garrett had kept frozen as Juliet's domain. They negotiated closet space and kitchen organization, different approaches to discipline and bedtime routines. Some friction was inevitable, but they learned to talk through disagreements rather than let resentment build. The support group continued to flourish, expanding to 60 families by December. They recruited additional facilitators, training parents who'd been attending to help lead discussions and coordinate activities. What had started as fragile experiment had become sustainable community. Christmas approached, and Garrett invited Warren and Beverly to Portland for the holiday. They arrived bearing extravagant gifts and genuine warmth. The visit felt more like family gathering than hostile evaluation. They attended the support group's holiday party, witnessing firsthand the community Garrett and Rowan had built. They watched Hazel perform in the children's sign language choir, her hands moving through Silent Night with confidence. When Beverly approached Rowan on Christmas Eve with tears in her eyes, pulling her into unexpected embrace, they both understood it as acceptance. Blessing. Welcome into family that had lost its center but was rebuilding around new foundation. Christmas morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through clouds. After presents had been opened and breakfast consumed, Hazel disappeared into her room to build elaborate dinosaur habitat with her new toys. Garrett found himself standing in front of the mantel where Juliet's urn sat beside their wedding photo. He hadn't lit the memorial candle in months, had gradually let the ritual fade as new routines replaced old grief practices. Rowan appeared at his shoulder, her presence announced by gentle hand on his back. "You okay?" "Yeah. Just thinking about her. About how different this Christmas is from the last one we spent together. Different isn't betrayal." Rowan's hands moved through the familiar reassurance. "She's still part of your story. Just not the whole story anymore." Garrett pulled out his phone, opened the video file he hadn't watched in months. Juliet appeared on screen, skeletal and determined, delivering her message about expanding hearts and choosing bravery. "She would have liked you," he signed after the video ended. "Would have approved of us." "I hope so." Rowan kissed his temple. "But Garrett, you don't need her permission to be happy. You don't need anyone's permission." "I know. But having it anyway, even retroactively, feels important." They stood together in front of the mantel, Garrett's arm around Rowan's waist. Both were true. Both mattered. The heart expanded to hold complexity. Hazel appeared in the doorway, signing, "Come play with me. Dinosaurs need architectural consultation for their habitat structures." They went, leaving Juliet's urn and photographs behind, but not forgotten. That evening, after Warren and Beverly had retired to the guest room and Hazel had finally collapsed into sleep, surrounded by wrapping paper and treasures, Garrett and Rowan sat on the couch in dim lamplight. "Thank you," he signed, "for choosing this, us. The complicated mess of blended family and progressive hearing loss and support groups and in-laws with opinions. Thank you for letting me in, for trusting me with Hazel, with your heart, with the pieces of yourself you thought were too damaged to share. We're not fixed. We're still works in progress. Everyone is. But we're works in progress together, which makes the hard parts bearable." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the Christmas tree lights blink in patterns Hazel had programmed. Outside, Portland's winter rain fell in steady rhythm, washing the streets clean. Garrett thought about the café where they'd met, about cruelty, inadvertently creating circumstances that brought Rowan into their lives. About Hazel's courage approaching a stranger to offer comfort. About the thousands of small choices that had accumulated into something resembling happiness. Love multiplied. It found new forms while honoring old foundations. Juliet would always be Hazel's mother. Always be the woman Garrett had built his adult life around. Always present in photographs and memories and the genetic code that gave their daughter green eyes and stubborn determination. But Rowan was here now, choosing them daily, building new traditions while respecting old ones, showing Hazel what deaf adults could accomplish, showing Garrett what partnership looked like after loss. In the morning he would make terrible pancakes. Rowan would contribute something more edible. Hazel would monopolize conversation with detailed explanations of her Christmas gifts. They would navigate the day with familiar rhythm. But tonight, Garrett simply held Rowan's hand and let himself be happy, completely present in this moment, earned through grief and courage and the willingness to believe that endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to keep living. He looked at Rowan, this woman who'd walked into his life through a stranger's cruelty and stayed through choice, who'd taught him that hearts don't replace, they expand, who'd shown Hazel that different doesn't mean broken, who'd proven that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just learns to take new shapes. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Hazel's hearing would continue to fade. The cochlear implant surgery loomed. The support group would need constant attention. Warren and Beverly would have opinions. Life would be complicated and messy and hard, but they would face it together. Not as broken people clinging to each other out of desperation, but as whole people choosing partnership. Not as replacements for what was lost, but as additions to what remained. Garrett pulled Rowan closer, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling her heartbeat steady against his side. This was enough. More than enough. It was everything he had stopped letting himself hope for, delivered through circumstance and choice, and the simple revolutionary act of two people deciding they were stronger together. The Christmas tree lights blinked off, then on again. Outside, the rain continued its rhythm. Hazel slept soundly in her room. Juliet's candle sat unlit on the mantel. And Garrett Sullivan, widower and father and architect of his own second chance, finally understood what Juliet had been trying to tell him in that final video: love doesn't have to be scarce. Hearts don't have to choose. And the bravest thing you can do after loss is let yourself be found again.